We're going to talk about building out snare drum samples and layering and how to use that in your mix to make sure it sounds as punchy and as powerful as possible. I'm revisiting an old mix I did like 10 years ago when I first started this YouTube channel. So it'll be fun to go back in time, take a look at what I did, learn from the mistakes that I might have made so that you don't have to make those. This is something that you need to get these fundamentals right if you ever want to make your music sound professional. And these strategies are going to work whether you're replacing live drums like I'm doing in this song, or if you're just trying to program your own drums. Let's give it a quick little sample here, and just heads up, because this is an old session, like half my plugins are missing. So the mix isn't perfect, but let's just see what it sounds like. That kick drum sounds awesome, but that's because I redid it in a different video. So if you want to learn about the kick drum, there's a link here or over here, whatever, here. All right, so that snare drum sounds super bitey, very snappy. So let's go through what the heck I got going on with it. So we have two snare tracks. We have the snare top and bottom. Like I mentioned, these are actual drum sounds. What's interesting is I have both the top and bottom feeding into Steven Slate trigger, which basically doesn't allow me to independently control the sample replacement for the bottom and top snare. So effectively, I'm summing it together and then replacing a lot of it with drum samples, which is maybe cool or maybe not. I don't know. But 84% is a lot of sample and not a lot of the actual mix. So here's what it sounds like. The top. Hear a lot of bleed in there. And the bottom sounds like this. So I put this channel strip on it. What am I doing? From gating. That's because there's a ton of kick drum in that snare. No wonder. That's pretty rough. When we're picking our snare drum sounds, what are we going for? What are we trying to accomplish here? So if you have live drums, it might be a good idea if you kind of like how your snare drum sounds in the actual recording to try to mimic the pitch when you're picking your samples. So if we go back to Steven Slate trigger and we turn this mix knob down, we can hear the raw sound of the drum. And as we increase this, you're going to get more and more of the samples. And if you look at what I did, when I was picking these samples, I actually adjusted the pitch of them to try to match the original tonality of the snare. So the samples will kind of blend a little bit more seamless, and then you can kind of maintain that uniqueness of the actual recording. This mix, when I did it a long time ago, is going for a snappy, like aggressive kind of snare sound. And the way to get there is by having a little bit higher tuned snare. And interesting, I don't even have the threshold set correctly because we missed that snare roll. There, that's a little bit better. Something else I want to mention when you're picking your snare drum sounds, right? I have a whole bunch I'm layering here. Like all these are in except for my Paramore one-shot sample. Okay, so two of these are direct. This is a room mic. I think it might actually be a one-shot. I have 3 direct mics. So 3 direct snare sounds. This room sound, it's very important that you don't ignore the room mics for snare drums. It's very, very, very important because modern music today, and maybe this is just a stylistic thing and maybe it'll change, but modern music has very roomy sounding snare drums. You're not going to get there with just a direct mic sample like that. You'll never ever get there. You can put a reverb on that and then kind of make it sound similar. But in my opinion, reverbs on snare drums tend to sound like 80s, which is even further back, right? The modern sound that you're hearing in a lot of these really aggressive records, the djenty stuff, the more groovy stuff, is from the room samples, okay? So we're going to definitely want to pick something that sounds nice and flat. The room sample should sound like you're listening to somebody playing drums through like a window, or like your neighbors in a garage or something, and and you hear the snare drum coming through. So it shouldn't have a lot of low end in it, and it shouldn't have a lot of top end in it either. We want it to sound subtle, more mid-rangey, so that when you're blending it into the mix, it doesn't just consume and get in the way of everything. The other thing that we need to talk about is the length of the snare drum samples themselves, okay? So if we go and take a look at what I did, if you use Stephen Slate Trigger, you can go to this View Curves button, and this allows you to adjust basically the length and the decay of the samples using this ASR, these knobs on every sample channel. This is your attack, this is your sustain and release. So I usually don't add any attack to it because it'll like swell into the sample, which we don't want. We're not trying to have it pumpy, we want it just to be loud right up front. And then clearly, there are ringing overtones or something that I'm getting rid of by shortening the sample length and the release settings of the sample, okay? Just for our own curiosity, let's hear what this sounds like without having this shortened. So normally, this is what the sample would sound like. So I'm just gonna solo this first one. Yeah, you hear the ring to it. Some people really like that, but this song is a little bit faster, more aggressive. We definitely need to tighten that up. So let me go back to where I had it before, and you can hear how much tighter and punchy the snare drum becomes. Now, you might not hear anything yet because the release is still very long. So now this is where it's going to really start tightening the sample up. So right here, we're getting rid of the ring from the body, and we can make it even tighter. Yeah. And I think I had it like this tight originally, which sounds a little bit too tight. I think I would want to open it up a little bit more. Yeah. That sounds a little bit more natural. And then you're getting all the aggression out of the shell without the ringy overtone. Okay. We can dial in the overtone in the space later using these room mics. Let's do the same thing now for this snare. So let me solo this so we can hear what that sounds like. Yeah. It's so tight. It's almost gated, it sounds like. Yeah. So the original snare sounds like this. So that's a bummer, right? Because you have that really annoying ring to it. You might be able to like EQ and notch it out, but I don't think that's going to really do the snare justice because you want some of those tones in there initially. So let's go and tighten this up like we had it before. Find the sweet spot where we're getting all the punch and aggression out of the snare, but no ring. There we go. This is, again, stylistically what I think is going to work. Some people like ringy type snares, but I don't think anybody would want the snare ringing as long as it was from the original sample. So make sure you're taking the time to do all this stuff. The next thing that we need to worry about now that we've kind of dialed in the lengths is that we need to make sure the samples are in phase with each other. So I talked about this on the kick drum video, and we're going to do the exact same thing for the snare. But again, when you're listening for phase coherence, it's less about the high frequencies and more about the low mid punch or the sub information if we're talking kick drums. When you're listening to try to know if something's in phase or not, listen for the body of the snare to disappear, not for something to happen in the snap or the initial attack. It took me years to figure this out. Nobody told me that it's the low energy that we care about. The top end stuff doesn't really matter that much. So let's flip in between this and see if we can identify when the body of the snare might drop out. In my opinion, when we have this flipped out of phase, it sounds a little bit thinner. So I would leave it like this. What that tells me is the samples probably are a little bit out of phase, but inverting the polarity isn't really going to change or cause too big of an issue for us. This is kind of what we're just stuck with. We might consider trying to take one out and see if that sounds better with just one sample then. So let's see what it sounds like. And again, listen for the mid-range crack and the body of that snare. And honestly, this snare really doesn't have a whole lot of that going on. So all the body is actually from this one. So either way, it's not going to matter too much. Let's see what this one sounds like. It just sounds kind of similar to these other ones. I don't think you should just layer samples because you think more is better. It's usually not the case. It usually makes everything more complex. So I'm just going to take this out because I don't see why I would have put that in there in the first place. Now that we know that these are in phase to the best that they can be, let's take a look at the room microphones now. If we bring in this room, we need to also do the same thing that we were doing before to make sure that the phase is coherent. So we're going to invert this back and forth and listen to see if the low mid punch of the snares go away. Okay, we want to try to keep it as punchy as possible. I don't know if I'm going crazy or my ears burned out, but this kind of sounded a little bit punchier to me. For me to do a sanity check, I'm actually going to use a tool called Sub Ninja. This is just an oscilloscope that allows you to dial in the low pass frequencies. So we can basically just focus on like the snare drum fundamental frequencies so we don't confuse ourselves with all the high frequency stuff. And then we can find out if the snare drum is decreasing in volume near the fundamental when we invert the polarity here visibly so that we don't have to rely on our ears 100% of the time. So it does look like maybe it's a little bit bigger with this inverted. I don't think we need to dwell on it. I think it'll sound fine either way because the differences are pretty small. If we want more punch, we can get there with some EQ later on. So at this point, now we have a snare drum that sounds like this, which is pretty good. So let's walk through some other things I have going on in the snare drum. So if we go to the snare top mic, I have Pro MB, and this is interesting. I'm using this as an expander. So this is kind of like a way for me to do a noise gate that has 2 bands. So this is kind of a cool thing. I stopped doing this, but I should definitely use it again. And I have it listening to the high frequencies. That's kind of clever. Basically, what you can do if you have an expander or a multi-band expander is just make your band. I have it crossing over at about 1K. Or if you have Pro MB, you can just put it in expand mode instead of compression. I have the range turned down to -13. So basically, it's like a gate at -13 dB until it detects the snare drum hit, and then it goes up to full volume. Okay, so what it's doing is it's trying to minimize the sound of all the crap that was picked up in that microphone that wasn't a snare drum. So it's really getting rid of a lot of the kick drum sounds and probably hi-hats. And the other thing that's important here is that I'm listening for this low band for the high frequency stuff. That way, kick drums are usually low frequencies. So if you shift it to the top part of the spectrum, you actually ignore a lot of the kick drums, so you'll reduce your false triggers on your gate or your expander. So this allows you to have a more accurate noise gate for your snare drum, which is cool. Because without it, listen to this. It just works really, really well. I might make a video on this. This is kind of a cool thing that I totally forgot about. And I already talked about what I did on the snare bottom mic here. So these 2 snare drums are then fed to a snare drum bus. So let's take a look at what we have here. So I have that Steven Slade trigger plugin on this track. And I had a virtual mix rack. So this is probably like some saturation or something. I don't have that anymore, so let's just get rid of it. Then I have a compressor, so this is going to squeeze together basically those 2 tracks. Anytime I sum tracks together on a bus, I usually will try to glue everything together with some sort of compression or like tape saturation. Those 2 things tend to work really, really well. So let's see what I got going on here. Wow, like 9 dB a gain. Yeah, you see, without the compressor, it just sounds kind of one-dimensional. The snare drum just has a little tick, and then it sounds like there's some weird reverb and room sounds in the back. But when you have the compressor, it actually adds some punch back to the snare drum, and then just the movement of that release from the compressor makes the room sound way, way, way bigger. Right? So the way to dial in a compressor to do that is you want to have a slower attack. And yeah, I think 30 milliseconds is like my magic number for a snare drum. This will allow the initial attack or the punch or the body of the snare to go through your compressor. So you're not nuking your snare, right? We don't want our snare drum to just sound flat and lifeless. So having that 30 milliseconds lets it snap through or punch through the compressor, and then the compressor bites on it, pulls the gain down, and then it will release back. What we want to do with the release is to make it rhythmic, make it kind of pump with the song. That way, when the release is coming back, the room sounds swell into the snare drum mic. Okay, that is what gives it this massive sound. If your release is too fast, it doesn't sound as powerful. You take away from that initial punch or the body of the snare. If it's too slow, it sounds smaller because the room sounds are lower in the mix. So let me just dial this in. You can just listen to it rhythmically, or you can also watch your gain reduction graph so that it kind of goes back to 0 before the next snare drum hits, is basically what you want to try to dial in. Yeah, and you can see that's exactly like what I did here, right? Right in between these snare drum hits, it's almost to 0 before another snare drum comes in. So maybe we go a little faster to get that to 0. Yeah. Or if we slow it down. You hear how it now sounds smaller because the room sounds are a lot quieter in the mix. If we go really fast release, it'll just feel not as punchy. Check it out. So it's less punchy, there's less body, but it's more aggressive and snappy. So that's why, I mean, it just depends on your taste, but stylistically for this, I think between like 80 and 120 milliseconds is like the right number. I personally like a little bit more breathing in there, especially because this is going to be mastered and it's going to just be smashed down anyways, and so everything's going to come up anyways. So I'll give it a little bit slower release just to let it breathe a little bit. Let's take a look at the EQ. What did I do? So I scooped out any of the residual boominess out of that track because it's a real mic, right? There's actual sounds from the room and the performer. So a lot of kick drum might bleed in there. So that's probably why I use this low shelf. And then I also have a little bit of resonance on it. And if you look, the resonance peaks right around 200 hertz. If you remember from earlier, that's where the fundamental of the snare drum lives. So this one move is going to be cleaning up any of the rumble and reinforcing the snare fundamental so that it gives it more punch. Okay, and clearly I added a little bit more around 260 hertz. This is again to give it a little bit more body. So if we put the spectrum in, I bet there's yeah, you can see that's where like the peak is, right? For the snare drum when it hits. Yeah, that is 100% punch right there. And then I also have a peak around 1100. I'm curious what that is. That's probably just to make it louder and more present on smaller speakers like your phone or like a laptop or something or a car. When you cut this frequency, it feels like the snare drum is getting sucked deeper into the mix. So we want to find the point where it doesn't sound nasally, but the snare drum is pulled closer to you, the listener. So let's find that. Right now we're getting dangerously close to being too nasally. That's way too nasally. I think right there's a safe bet. This is a tape compressor. This is by Waves. This is Kramer tape. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier, where I like to glue instruments together using like tape compression. So let's see what I did here. If I dial this back, it's probably gonna get punchier and maybe snappier. So let's see and listen. It just adds a lot of glue, but if you use this too much, you lose all of your punch. And I find that if this little needle thingy goes like above -10 for gain reduction or whatever this is set to, I don't even know what this is set to. But if it goes above this, there's a good chance that your snare drum is losing its punch, okay? We want to have it punchy. This is hard-hitting music. Let's not destroy all our transients. Still punchy and snappy. Now we're starting to get splatty, in the splatty territory is what I would call that. Stylistically, some people might love that. That's fine. But just notice that our fundamentals no longer punchy, right? It's starting to go away. And if we go down too far, it just sounds lifeless. Do what you think sounds good, but just be aware of what's going on when you do this type of move. And then finally, I have a clipper, and I just want to just shave off the top of this peak. This is what I usually will do anytime I have, again, mics feeding into some bus for the drums. I do this on my kick drums. I do this on my toms. I don't do this on cymbals, I don't think. I usually use a limiter on that because I want it to be softer. Clippers can add a lot of harmonics on the top end of stuff. And so cymbals, I stay away from the clippers. But for this snare drum, let's just see. Yep, just barely touching it. That is a peek behind the curtain of how I'm doing stuff so that you know how to approach picking snare drum samples. So let's listen one more time. That is my approach for picking samples, how to layer them, and the importance of dialing in the right length of the samples and then making sure everything is phase aligned to the best that it can be. And you also got the bonus of getting to see what I did on my snare bus. So then you also learned how to glue all these tracks together to add the most space and punch possible on your snare bus using compression and some tape saturation. So is this eye-opening? Did you learn anything new, or do you have a different approach that gives you better results, perhaps? Let me know in the comments below. In the description, I have a link to download my free mixing and mastering plugins guide. I also have some free drum samples that I like to use in there. So if you're tired of your drum sounds or you want something new to experiment with, be sure to go and download that. My name is Bobby Balo. I'm the mixing and mastering engineer at Raytown Productions, and I'll see you in the next video.